So this photo was taken by Dan Devereaux, who many of you may know is a natural resource planner in Brunswick. Anyway, so I love this photo because it's got great detail. It gives you an image of the marsh you don't see from the road. But it also shows just how wet the marsh surface is. And you can kind of see also along the edge of the channel, there are these embankments. In some cases, they're pretty tall, a couple of feet, 3, 4 feet even. And, you know, we were thinking, what's going on here? You can see it on the left side of the image. There are large dead areas. That's kind of the dead standard that I was telling you about. We were really concerned, you know, we were thinking, well, how do we report this in terms of, you know, did the project achieve what it was supposed to? Because it's killed a lot of plants, but nothing's coming back in. Eventually, the vegetation did come in. We saw salt tolerant plants, but you know, I like this image just because it shows how wet the marsh got after we let all that, you know, the high tide back in. So, you know, in sum, I think we were out there monitoring for five years after the culvert was replaced. And we submitted a report, all that is available. But we decided, you know, we're really interested in what's going on here. This is a dynamic system. It's still changing. And so we still go out every couple of years. And we still sample the vegetation. We've been monitoring the channel evolution because it's actively eroded still. And, you know, the truth is that this marsh is actually quite threatened, I think, still today. One of the things that we saw was, this is a great picture in the lower right-hand corner, just shows how much water was getting up into the southern part of the marsh and just parked there. There was no way for it to get out. It couldn't drain, and it caused all this vegetation to die off. Part of the reason for that is because you've got several basically impediments, flow impediments in the middle of the channel downstream of that. This right here is a big rock channel, rock ford, at a narrow part of the marsh. You can see that the waters are impounded upstream of that. Another concern is that the road was just not built higher. When they replaced the culvert, DOT did not actually increase the road height at all. And so as sea levels have risen and as we've had winter storms, the road is overtopped. And, you know, in this case, I think the road is under like 3-4 feet of water. So there's all this water getting up into the marsh, but it's not able to drain out as well as it needs to. Part of the problem also is the history of farming on the marsh, and I'm going to let Tatia mostly talk about that. But I took a training on how to think about and how to remedy agricultural impacts of marshes. And in that training, I used Long Marsh as an example, just to start thinking about the network of embankments and ditches that are out there. And this is what I came up with as a map. It's definitely not exhaustive, but it shows, for example, the blue line around the perimeter of the marsh. That's a ditch to drain fresh water out and drain it out into the channel. We have the yellow lines are embankments that are still evident on the marsh today. And so you can see now with the higher tide heights, the water's getting up over the embankments, but getting trapped there behind those embankments and forming these pools that are getting bigger and bigger. We call them mega pools. I'm sure Tatia will talk about that. So it's great that this project is moving forward. I really think that the marsh needs more work to be resilient, and I look forward to your questions. Should we save questions to the end, or? Okay. Scott. Because of the point that rates long complaints. Well, I think either way, there's going to be more water coming down the cove, and so you want to be able to accommodate it, right? So letting the water in and letting the water out is going to be most resilient, both for the ecosystem and I think for the people who live on the other end of the road. Yeah. But so building the road up, I mean, the other option would be to try and build the road so it's able to tolerate being flooded. Right now, it was not designed to be flooded, and so you have erosion happening. Is that anything to do with that part of this? No. Yeah. not for this site, but I think we could easily come up with one. Yeah. Did you prepare a sea level rise map? I should have thought of that. Yeah, we can pull up a website. Yeah, the Maine Geologic Survey has a really nice sea level rise storm surge viewer you can look at online to get a sense for where tides are likely to be by 2100. Yes. Great. Tatia.
And then there's Matt's contact info. So I kind of wanted to count why I am here. I'm based up in Bar Harbor, so I'm a little ways from home. But really, my position with me is just couched under our Marshes for Tomorrow initiative, which is really focused on land protection of marshes and where they're going to migrate. And as we got into that space more, we're recognizing that a lot of the salt marshes in the East Coast and Maine need restoration. So we created two positions, myself and my colleague Nicole Sanders, and we really help to do project management for these types of projects up and down the state. So that's kind of how we got involved. And I will say Matt and Matt have really great partners, and Matt was really an advocate for restoring the site. So yeah, thank you to him for bringing us down here. And Matt, kind of, you all seem to know where Long Marsh is, but just the scar and then that long marsh all the way down. And yeah, just to highlight the full project team. So it's really collaborative. Purple Heritage Land Trust, the town of Harpswell, Baxter State Authority, Casco Bay, Estuary Partnership, and MCHG have really been the project team. And we're still in early days, so I'll go into kind of where we are a little bit later, but this project will be a multi-year project, so you'll get updates from us, see our lovely faces over the next several years. I also wanted to highlight the Salt Marsh Adaptation and Resiliency teams, or the SMART teams. They're a sort of pseudo-formal group of professionals in the salt marsh space, so researchers, land managers, restoration practitioners, and they're really the experts in decoding the impacts of salt agriculture, those embankments and ditches that Matt talked about that are prevalent on every salt marsh, essentially on the East Coast. And they've been a partner and are creating restoration design plans for this. And they do workshops, they're all about collaboration. So I just want to highlight them as really the kind of underlying scientific experts for this type of work. And so, what are the ecological values and services of the marsh? We have wildlife habitat, so I'm sure a lot of you, when you walk past the marsh, you see birds, shorebirds, nesting sparrows, that kind of thing. They're also really important industries for marine species, so a study out of Wells estimated almost 2/3 of our commercial species spend some part of their life in salt marshes, so they're really crucial to keep our coastal industries vibrant and our coastal communities. Birds nest there, forage there. They provide flood, storm, and storm surge protection, so both freshwater flooding and coastal storm surge. They can filter nutrients from our communities, and they store a ton of carbon. So it's estimated that salt marshes store up to 10 times more carbon on a per acre basis as upland forests. So that's a powerhouse, right? There's not as many acres of salt marshes in Maine as there are forests, but it's still a lot, and we want to make sure that that remains the same. I think marshes provide, a sense of place. They're beautiful. They're places to recreate. they hold also cultural significance. So some of you might be familiar with sweetgrass. Salt marshes are places where sweetgrass can be found, but also hold other important Wabanaki resources and relatives. They're places for science and education. Definitely learn every time I go out there. And really, I think salt marshes are going to play a really key component of coastal resiliency as we move into the climate future. And there are a lot of marsh processes. They're complicated, right? There's like time, there's tides, there's weather, there's freshwater inputs. But I wanted to highlight some of the key ones that will be relevant for the rest of my talk. So they're intertidal. They live between, mean high water and mid tide. Sorry, I'm gonna get that wrong. I'm gonna stop. But they're intertidal, and the flood tide is very important. When the flood comes in, it brings sediment, drops the sediment onto the salt marsh to help it build. That brings in nutrients, flushes byproducts of the salt marsh, and that sediment is captured by marsh plants and roots. And that process over time helps the marsh to build. So it's always kind of, when it's healthy and thriving, that marsh holds a consistent relationship with mean sea level. And that layering of sediments and plant material builds over time is that dense carbon storage. There are very specific plants that live in salt marshes that are adapted to inundation frequencies. So some plants can handle twice daily flood tides, so that would be spartina flora, and some plants can only handle being flooded twice monthly or so, which is some of the cadence of salt that I'll talk about. But ultimately, all of those plants need some level of air exposure. They need the time to go out. They're not built for being submerged 24/7. They need to get their feet dry a little bit. But ultimately, thriving marshes need a sediment supply, and they also need proper hydrology so that the plants are not fully submerged. And like I said, healthy marshes can kind of keep pace, keep their relative location relative to sea level rise. However, if they're not healthy, sea level rise is a threat. There are other threats to salt marshes, excessive nutrients from runoff, coastal squeeze, where our development prevents marshes from migrating and moving and being dynamic with sea level rise. Tidal restrictions, if they're not addressed, can be a threat, both from holding water on the marsh, but also restricting the sediment delivery, right? So you're kind of limiting that factor. I'm going to focus a lot on the legacy impacts of salt agriculture because that's a really emerging topic, again, driven by the smart teams and their work. And how those legacy impacts are leading to loss of vegetation and subsidence or slow sinking of the marsh over time. So a little historical detour into salt agriculture. If you go to any presentation about this work, you'll see this image. There's really not a great, I'd say, record of salt agriculture, but it's being uncovered more and more. But you can see Acadian farmers doing salt agriculture as we know it, which was really a colonial practice from the 1600s to the 1900s, where they would do massive modifications of the salt marsh to increase the productivity of salt hay, which is used to feed livestock, mulch gardens, thatched roofs, really did a lot for communities. And so the techniques were to build up tall parts of the salt marsh called embankments. So every time a flood tide comes in, the plants go dormant a little bit. So if they could block out that tide, the plants would be more productive. Then they would also dig systematic drainage ditches all up through the marsh, which Matt highlighted in his diagram. They're very pervasive, and there were layers of generations of different ditching strategies out there. And those, like I said, very pervasive, layered over generations, and The embankments and the ditching have now just been left out on all the salt marshes where salty agriculture was really active, and are continuing to modify and alter the hydrology and the way water is flowing both onto and off the marsh, and that's what's leading to the subsidence and degradation that we see. In southern New England states, there was also a big practice of mosquito ditching in like the 40s, but Maine doesn't have as much of that. That can be a factor in this work as well. So just some cool historical images. So this is what an embankment would have looked like, where you have this sluice valve that would close upon the high tide, sometimes made of rubber or wood, and would block out the incoming tide, but then open up at low tide when there wasn't that pressure, so that any water on the marsh side would be able to drain. Practices also like the drying of hay on these saddles. They drive pieces of log, pieces of wood into the salt marsh to hold the salt hay up a little higher so it wouldn't get wet when the flood tide came in, and it would allow that marsh hay to dry out so they could take it off when it was dry. So that's kind of some images of that. I think that's really cool. And that's the legacy one out there. Then we have some boat wharfs, right? So that people would, especially in like riverine salt marshes, would build infrastructure there, and then they could just take the salt hay from there and go deliver it to where they need to go. Just some rapid fire images of salt marshes that have been modified. So you can see those really drastic straight lines. So that's what some of the salt marshes look like, where there's really high density ditching, sprinkled in with, it's kind of hard to get my thing. Sprinkled in with things like this, which are areas where the water is not draining. So that's that mega pool where the water can't get off the marsh. So you have kind of those two things happening at once. There's over draining, a lot of ditches, and also those ditches get clogged and start to hold water, which kill off the plants. Out on the landscape, they can look like this, where you have that massive embankment with ditching on either side. So they dig Bauer ditches. Where they dig a drainage ditch, use that material to build up the height of the embankment. This is in Harrington, Maine. It's a cool remnant of that trunk ditch, so you can actually see the little knob where the sluice valve would have been attached, which is really neat. And they can be very subtle, like the one you see on the left. These ditches where you can almost hardly see it. It's very small and shallow. Or you can have these massive 10-foot deep ditches. And then on the landscape, especially when it's green, they can further dissolve. And so, looking out here, there's not very many obvious straight lines or infrastructure, embankments, or ditching. But you can actually, once you go out there and get an eye for it, you can start to see that some of these standing water pools start to have straight edges, and that's indicative of these features. So I'm just going to highlight, again, this was developed by our SMART team, but this is a project on the York River, and so you can see these massive areas of standing water, which again, I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail. I feel like I'm kind of jumping the gun on why standing water is so bad, but you can see that pool in particular on the right-hand side has this very distinct 90-degree angle. So you're like, okay, I'm starting to see some human impact. I'm starting to see some straight lines. The SMART team went out and mapped all of these agricultural features on that marsh. So similar to what Matt created. They're just everywhere and they're very pervasive. And so they identify them both through remote imagery and through soil probing the site to kind of understand the difference in densities of these features. But okay, so historical detour over, how is that leading to marsh degradation on salt marshes that we interact with today? And it's hard to avoid these technical terms, but there's kind of two paths. There's both oxidative subsidence, where you have deep ditches that are exposing deep layers of heat to air. that air provides oxygen to decomposing bacteria. They can now access all that carbon that we want to be missing, right? And they start to chomp on that, and then the marsh slowly kind of sinks over time. So that's oxidative subsidence. Then you have waterlogged subsidence, where you have those embankments, those tall areas holding water on the marsh. A ditch fails, the water can't escape anymore. It starts to get more and more saturated. It starts to drown those plants that need some level of aeration, and they need the tide to go out, basically. And when those plants die, all of the volume of their roots kind of goes away, and now you have a little depression, and now you have a little cup to hold more water, and that kind of exacerbates itself and causes these ever-expanding megabools, we call them, and that, especially that initial loss of root volume, is called the waterlogged subsidence. But you can see how these two things are like different versions, different sides of the same coin, right? It's all about hydrology. It's just in some areas there's too much drainage, in other areas there's no drainage. And so this is just one image of that oxidative subsidence, where you have that open ditch causing the water to go down to the bottom, and you have that area that's now exposed. And then this is on Long Marsh, where you can see the waterlogged subsidence trajectory kind of escalate over time. So this is go to Google Earth, look at any marsh that you love, and go through time. You'll see this over and over again. But this is 2003. You can see there's kind of a mix of vegetation and the dark areas, which are standing water. 2013, things are different. It's probably that cattail that's actually coming in. The vegetation looks different, but it's still vegetated, and there are areas of standing water. And then as sea level rise continues, that just gets more and more waterlogged, and that's in 2024. So, you're exacerbating, sea level rise is exacerbating all of the issues and leading to lack of vegetation. And so this is a very overly simplified document, but we have these diagram. We have these processes that are causing areas of the marsh to subside, both where they're waterlogged and when they're over aerated. And then we have sea level rise coming in the opposite direction, right? And so remember, salt marshes exist in this very specific band relative to sea level rise. So eventually, if sea level rise surpasses that band, the salt marsh can't actually exist anymore. So we'll actually convert away from salt marsh, which we don't want to happen because of all of the beneficial properties and services that we talked about before. And so the goal of restoration is to revise that trajectory. So stop that subsidence, allow the marsh to start building itself, and stay in tote with sea level. And so to do that, we're trying to fix the hydrology through a couple different methods. So that salte agriculture caused parallel hydrology, I would call it, and we want to establish a single channel hydrology. So almost dendritic, right? Almost like a tree or a tributary, where you have these like main channels that branch off into smaller and smaller channels that can kind of be sized to how much flow there is. And that mimics our best understanding of pre-agricultural salt marshes. And the location of the hydrology or the flow paths are based on the salt marsh, the tidal range, the topography of the site. And to establish that single channel hydrology, we use two methods, again, for those two sides of the same coin. The first is ditch remediation, so areas where there's too much ditching, we want to halt that oxidative subsidence, right? And we want to reduce that ditch depth. So we want to bring the bottom of that ditch upward so that not as much of the peat is exposed to air. And to do that, we typically mow salte next to a ditch that we're going to remediate, and we roll that into a little burrito. We secure it into the bottom of that ditch, and we do that over and over again over the course of like 3 to 5 years. So we're kind of layering this vegetation, and in between years, that salte is capturing sediments. It's kind of settling down, and it's starting to mimic the peat on either side. And you kind of build that over time slowly, so you're healing the scar from the bottom up. And this is an example. This was some research by David Burdick, who's on the SMART teams, of a treated ditch on the left, where you can see that they kind of already had filled it in. Before, the ditch looked like the images on the right. And then on the left, after several years, it started to heal. The ditch remediation brought the levels up, plants started to grow, and so you can almost not see that on the landscape anymore compared to the other ditch, which is just, again, still very deep and over-oxidizing the peat. And so this is kind of what I'm just going to rapid fire through some images of this happening out on a salt marsh. So there's some specialized equipment, so like a hay mower, and then a hay rake, which forms that bundle that I was talking about. You take some, biodegradable twine and stakes and use that to secure into the ditch bottom. And that's what that kind of looks like over time. Not really, can't really see much going on. These were earlier on, so still have some more years to go for these ditches, but where the stakes are on the image on the right in particular, there was no vegetation when this project started, and so you can already kind of see that with that substrate, the Spartina alterniflora is coming in. So more ditch remediation. Then the other technique, so that's the over-oxidated side of the coin. Then we have the waterlogged side of marshes. And to fix that hydrology issue, we do what's called channel remediation, or runneling, we call it sometimes, where we're basically reconnecting these areas that are artificially holding water for too long. We want to connect that to regular tidal exchange. And so we dig wide and shallow flow paths that we call runnels. So you can kind of see the dimensions there. They're 24 to 30 inches wide, and they're less than 10 inches deep. And we try to do that without impacting salt marsh area that hasn't already been modified by the agricultural practices already. But that is basically going to not only allow the area of the marsh that is holding water to drain that water, but then it's now also a path for the sediment to get up onto the marsh and help it to build over time. And when we're digging, we have all this peat left over from the process, and so we try to use that beneficially to create microtopography on the landscape. So we'll build just microtopography mounds, or marsh mounds, sometimes they're called. So they can be 8 to 10 feet in diameter, and they're very shallow, so 8 to 10 inches tall. And they just form these kind of high elevation islands throughout the marsh, which can provide, in an ideal world, nesting refuges for salt marsh sparrow and Nelson sparrow, which nest on the surface of the marsh. But in another case, just provide some biodiversity and heterogeneity on the landscape. This is what that looks like. So typically, to get the most uniform runnels, we use excavating equipment on weight dispersal mats. And the impact of that machinery is actually less than a human standing on the marsh in terms of pounds per square inch. So they can form really uniform runnels and microtopography mounds. We also can dig runnels by hand, which are very obvious when you see them because they're not as neat and they don't look as good, but they do serve their purpose and can be a really fun activity. And then this is one runnel with the microtopography mounds on either side that you can see. And this is kind of an even spacing from the runnel, but we can also kind of make them more randomized on the landscape as well. And over time, this is a microtopography mound. You can kind of barely see the ring, but that's it after just, I think, 2024, that's after 1 year. So they're full of seeds, they're full of roots and rhizomes of the plant, and they recover really quickly. And then I know we're kind of running tight on time. I want to make sure there's enough time for questions, so I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly, but just some site photos of projects. So classic mega pool. This is post-restoration, so that pool is no longer holding water. This was in drought and low tide conditions. And then very subtle, this is some monitoring that we're doing on the edge of these pools. And so if you just kind of watch where the quadrat is, you can start to see that the plants are kind of growing in healthier and denser from the edges. And that's the goal, is that the plants just start to close that open mega pool over time. And this is what that looks like. You can see the kind of marching line of the Spartina alterniflora plants. They're like, oh, I'm so happy I can live out here now again. And they just kind of keep sending their rhizomes out into the pool. And again, just some vegetation here. And the next year, it's just denser, thriving, and it's continuing to march into the middle of the pool. And then this is my favorite one. But empty little mega pool, and then the next year it's full of pickleweed, which is kind of one of those early successional plants. That's starting to fill in. And then you have, this is up in Hancock, Maine, but you can see on the left-hand side is a project that was restored. You can actually see the runnel paths. It was literally a month. Google did a flyover a month after we finished. I was very excited. And then the right-hand side was not restored. That's some private property that we haven't gotten permission to restore yet. So just I'll kind of wrap up on some wildlife considerations and then the Long Marsh project and its timeline. But just some kind of nuts and bolts. The ditch remediation and the runneling happens outside of kind of like key life cycle. So the ditch remediation happens in the late fall, and then the runneling happens all winter long and kind of wraps up by mid-March typically, or sorry, mid-May at the very latest. But usually it's done by mid-April. Salt marsh sparrow, which I didn't really highlight at the beginning, in error, but salt marsh sparrows, they nest directly on salt marsh, and so do Nelson sparrows, and so they're really, really sensitive to changes in sea level rise, and they've already seen an 87% decline in their population numbers. So the idea of restoring the marsh to keep it from subsiding further, we hope that that can help restore the populations of these birds. Same with shorebirds. They roost and forage in salt marshes during high tides and during migrations. And they're often seen in pools, but I just always want to highlight that the mega pools, especially in the in the first like 10 years of the restoration, will not be completely dry. They'll just be dynamic, right? At higher tides, there will be water in there, but that water will be able to drain off, so there will be a lot of food and ability for those shorebirds to thrive still. And some out of Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, they've studied the impacts of runnel pools, and actually those areas had way more shorebird populations, shorebird numbers and biodiversity compared to mega pools that were left untreated. And then, so yeah, we're doing that at Long Marsh. We're going to be doing runnels and ditch remediation, and this is a kind of very brief timeline. Last year, we formed our project team. We got funding from the EPA to do this project. Ideally, at the end of, currently from late 2025 to present, Smart Teams is creating those restoration design plans, and we'll make sure that those can be available and viewed. And ideally this summer, we'll get permitting in, and then we'll definitely be doing pre-restoration monitoring. So these projects, we always get a baseline condition and track how that changes over time with our interventions, kind of similar to Matt's long-term monitoring with the road replacement. We'll do a couple phases of implementation over winter seasons, this winter and into next winter. And then the ditch remediation, again, is that longer treatment will continue for 3 to 5 years, and we'll just continue to long-term monitoring and do any adaptive management if we need to do any tweaks down the line if the marsh isn't restoring the way we want it to. And then these are just this is how a design looks. I won't go into the specifics to give some time for questions, but we've got the agricultural mapping, we've got the idealized hydrology, and then we have the different treatment techniques that are all kind of nested into the site. And I'll just end it there unless people want to really dive deep in that in the Q&A. But thank you so much, and Matt and I can take any questions from Zoom or otherwise. So.
So, Marsh is a mile, 0.7 long? It's over a mile long. Where do you start? The south end, where it's, because of the tidal flows, and maybe I'm just curious, that's where you're going to start the initial remediation?
Typically, it's more about access than anything. You don't necessarily need to time it or strategize based on its location. But we've kind of worked with Harpswell Heritage Land Trust. We've been brainstorming different ways to get down onto the marsh, because you can imagine that excavator on weight dispersal mats, they have to literally leapfrog those 4 panels over. It's very slow going, and so you have to be strategic in where you start. And it'll probably be some like out and back missions, some going the length of the marsh. We'll figure that out this summer. Marianne, yeah.
Yes, I was explaining the project to the Resources Committee this afternoon, and they were quite excited about it, actually.
Awesome.
But they did have a question, and they were wondering, north of Long Marsh Lane, that is an area that we open for harvesting periodically.
Mm-hmm.
They were concerned while you're doing the work, what kind of an effect it would have on that part of Downey Road.
Honestly, very little. Typically, we're timing things, from my understanding, right? The biggest thing that I could imagine is that when you first dig the runnel, there is that kind of release of water. And depending on the pool and the size of it, it can be a lot of water, it could be a minimal amount of water. And so that can lead to some very short-lived turbidity, but nothing more that would be normal in, let's say, like a big rain event, I would say. And if that was a concern, and we could talk about it too, you could always kind of phase the runneling a little bit so that you're kind of doing that as a more slowly released manner.
After the project's finished, what would be the net effect in that area? I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, in terms of the shellfish, I mean, my understanding is that they spend some of their life in salt marshes. So a healthier salt marsh will lead to better populations. And then not only that, you have improved water quality from all the plant material being natural filters. And you won't have the kind of rapid flushing of like sulfates and stuff that can build up in the pools and can be kind of rinsed with super high tide events. So I think overall, like water quality will be improved in the long term and better habitat.
It would seem to, if you're stopping subsidence, it would seem to be a net gain for the intertidal.
Yeah, right. Like it's hard to, even though those pools all are on the salt marsh, they're lacking so many of the core functions of salt marshes that some areas it's like 30% of it are these pools that are really stagnant. And so by revegetating, yeah, you're kind of increasing the area. And then, I don't know if that actually answered your question, sorry. If you want to rephrase it. Okay. Yeah.
What impact does the Phragmites have on the success or failure of the whole project?
It's a really...
Do you mind kind of repeating the question
Oh,
before answering?
yeah.
So we can hear?
Yeah, the question was, what are the impacts of Phragmites on the project? And so that is one part that I did not address. But the Phragmites at the southern end of the salt marsh. There's some big patches. You can use these strategies actually to treat Phragmites as well. So we would dig, we call them like innovative Phragmites treatment runnels, where they're a little deeper, they're bringing more salinity into the frag areas to kind of drive and lower those numbers. And in some areas that's been able to reduce the Phragmites by like 60 to 80%. So it can actually be incorporated into the design. But like for the success, I think Phragmites wouldn't necessarily impact salt marsh north of that kind of fort. Maybe I could pull up I don't know if I could do that on Zoom. Would they see my screen?
Yeah.
If I pulled up Google Earth? I don't know if it's worthwhile to do that. Maybe I can actually click back. 55 slides. So this area is kind of what I understand to be the real delineation to points further south have a lot of frag, and points further north not so much frag. And so if we're bringing salinity down south, that's going to treat the Phragmites. The thing about Phragmites, though, is that it's very rampant, right? And so it can clog channels. So I think that will require a lot more touch points, and we'll need to check in to make sure that any runnels are actually staying open and providing that connection. So it could just need more adaptive management into the future. And then as sea level rise comes in more, we might have to kind of continue to extend and follow that salinity gradient. Yeah, once you see them, I'm sorry, you'll see it everywhere and you won't be as excited to drive around. But it's very pervasive. It's a tall grass with a kind of fluffy top. Yeah, it grows a lot of the time in disturbed areas, ditches. And what we've realized is that it also really likes the kind of marginal ditch that, if you remember that blue ditch that went all the way around the upland edge of the salt marsh, it really likes that area because it can get a little bit of salt, a little bit of fresh, and it can outcompete some of the other brackish species in those areas. So it's definitely a concern overall in the salt marsh world, but it can be incorporated into restoration designs as well. Yeah.
So you mentioned shorebirds using the standing water habitat, and I see them all the time in these mega pools up there.
Yeah.
If you're successful in restoring the marsh and eliminating those pools, is there a potential negative impact for shorebird habitat?
It's a good question, and I think ultimately more research needs to be done. So some project partners that I work with were doing some shorebird monitoring with Maine Department Inland Fisheries and Wildlife to track that through the life of a project to better understand how the runneling and the changes in standing water will impact shorebirds. Ultimately, though, they're kind of like loafing and like picking around, right, on the salt marsh. They're just trying to get out of their main foraging habitat, which is the mud flats. And so when the tide comes in, they're like, oh, let me go loaf around on the salt marsh. And so I think they're picking at invertebrates and things that are in the pools, but those won't go away when we runnel them, really. Those macroinvertebrates will still be around. But it could vary based on whether it's a king tide time or a neap tide. So if most of the tides aren't getting up onto it, that could cause the shorebirds to maybe go loaf around in the vegetated areas. Or, but if it's higher tide, those old mega pool depressions will have some water in them. So ultimately, like, our best understanding is that it will positively impact shorebirds by increasing the quality of the habitat of salt marshes, but I don't think that there's been the most long-term study and tracking of that over time to really drive that home, especially for Maine. Yeah, did you want to add something? Yeah.
these methods have been used in other parts of the country more than they have in Maine. And I think the big picture is to try and make sure that the marsh stays around, right? That we have a marsh in 100 years. But there are some questions. I think there's a lot of research need, around, like, I was sitting here thinking, what's the impact going to be to green crabs? Maybe green crabs are not going to be as prevalent because there's less habitat for them. That's a lovely picture of Phragmites seed heads right there. What are the impacts going to be to mosquitoes that are in the pools, or forage fish? So, I think there are a lot of questions, and we're just at the beginning of trying to learn about all those changes that are going to come.
Yeah, thank you. Right, because if we end up not having salt marshes, right, that will be the worst case scenario for I think a lot of different species.
Do either of you know, I know that sort of 10 times the amount of upland forest for carbon storage number. I'm assuming there's been some research done on the number, perhaps per acre, of like flood storage that a marsh can do when it's like at its most healthy and resilient state. Do either of you know what that might be? Like how much can that sponge fit when it floods?
More. No, I'm not sure of the figures, but that's a really interesting question of comparing, that ability, that service, I guess, on marshes through time and through restoration or otherwise. Yeah, I'm sure there's got to be some studies out there.
What is this project costing?
It's a great question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Money. How much does this project cost? I would say for resiliency efforts, it's relatively inexpensive compared to some maybe road costs. But all in all, including designs, it's about $3,000 per acre. So this project estimated around 70 acres, 210,000. Is that the right math? 210,000. Yeah. Yes, yeah, this was EPA funding dispersed to actually Restoring America's Estuaries, which put out a proposal, an application period, and we're funded through Restoring America's Estuaries. The kind of tricky thing with these really long-lived projects, though, is that that grant from EPA, RAE, is only 2 years. So we have funding set aside for the remaining portion of the later years of the project. Luckily, the costs are really concentrated to the first 24 months or so. So it's kind of a trailing edge after that.
There was a question on Zoom, I think it was earlier, but do any of the abutters still use the marsh or the channelizations in the marsh? Is it still used for any of the past agriculture purposes, I guess?
I mean, not that I have heard. Emma, have you heard of folks using the marsh for haying?
No, and I'm not even sure that would be allowed with like current, like zoning and such, whether you could have livestock down on the marsh. I'm not aware of any of that.
Just recreation, bird watching, like birds. I don't think we have any salt haying plans in the future. I saw a show, I don't know if it was on PBS or one of the local network, but it was your work, I think in Booth Bay, and do you have another place it was this exact process, and it was a video, and perhaps you were in it.
Was it an MCHT video? Was it a Maine Coast Heritage Trust video?
No, this was on, I was just cruising through some of the channels and more interesting.
Maybe like a news story.
Is Borealis today, do you know that show? It's about places
Oh.
in Maine.
No, I don't know if I've made it to prime time. There are a number of
Are
other.
there other folks doing this sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great segue. So the question was whether we had done any footage or filming of these projects that would be on TV. But there are a lot of folks who are doing Salt Marsh restoration in Maine, in Massachusetts, down into the Chesapeake. There are a lot of folks that are all focused on this issue and fixing the hydrology. In Maine, we have a whole network that comes together twice a year to talk about issues, to collaborate, to share resources. Matt and I are both on the steering committee of that network. So I would say it's just a very collaborative space, and we all do a lot of work to increase outreach and education about these issues, because salt marshes can really be kind of silent and invisible heroes, I think, of the coast for a lot of folks, unless you live near one.
Oh, thank you. Really informative, and I thought you did a really nice job. The Sunday paper had a front page article on, I'm not going to get it right, but stabilizing salt marshes, or I think it was maybe riverine marsh areas with willows. Is that, are you doing any, is there any need for shoreline stabilization in this project? I mean, you've been focusing on getting rid of the pools and doing that, but is there anything else that you're thinking about as this?
That's a good question. So the question was about stabilization of the marsh, potentially using freshwater marsh as an example, where they had used willows to stabilize an eroding channel wall. I would say that is something to consider as we move forward, but at this point, halting that subsidence trajectory and allowing the marsh to just start to recover is the priority. But with sea level rise, you do anticipate, and I'm sure you've seen the calving and the increase in the channel size over time.
One of the things that we were tracking for our monitoring was basically surveying the channel, how deep the channel is, and taking cross sections of the channel. And what we noticed was the channel became very angular, right, immediately after the project. So there was a head cut that was working its way up from the road crossing. And if you think about it, I mean, the road was impounding water upstream for a century or longer. And so the marsh over time, grew accustomed essentially to that hydrology. And then when you restored that natural tidal flow, the channel had to expand in order to accommodate not only, the increase in water coming into the channel, but also more water coming up in the marsh and having to drain off. So, what we see, and it's still changing, but the channel is still scouring and it's eroding laterally. And I think we have to let that natural process play out before we can start to think about stabilizing the channel. But it's a great question. I mean, because I think I'm not sure if she's here today, but there's someone who lives on Long Reach Lane who said to me many times, hey, the channels, like the marsh downstream is really eroding. We think it's related to this. I think there's probably some truth to that, but also, I mean, we see it everywhere. The marshes are eroding because of sea level rise. They just have to, there's more water draining off the marsh.
How big of a threat are green crabs to the roots of the salt marsh if you're trying to encourage the salt hay to grow back in? Do you have to worry about that?
Yes, I think you do have to worry about that. I don't know. I'm not a green crab expert. I'm not going to lie to you. Matt, do you want to add anything about green crab?
Can you repeat the question?
I was wondering how big of a threat the green crabs are to the salt hay that you're trying to encourage to grow in. Are you fighting a battle with them as they're trying to eat the roots?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly we see a lot of impacts from green crabs in eelgrass. So eelgrass is submerged most of the time, not in the marshes. But anecdotally, we did not try and track green crabs in Long Marsh for our monitoring. And I honestly can say, anecdotally, I did not see a lot of them in Long Marsh. But I know in other marshes to the south, like down in Wells, at the Rachel Carson Reserve and other locations, they have seen green crabs burrowing. And I think in some cases are actually using the remnant ditches that have grown over, the little tunnels in the marsh, and they're going in there at low tide as refuge. So, you know, I think it's a question that probably is worth looking at, you know? When we're doing these marsh surface hydrology restoration projects, how is it impacting the abundance of green crab? You know, is it creating better green crab habitat, or is it removing green crab habitat? I don't think we know. Probably some curious grad student is thinking about it right now. But if you know anybody who wants to start studying that, let me know, because I think it would be interesting to look at.
So I know Baxter State Park is one of the landowners. What other landowners are involved in where you are working on the project?
Yeah, great question. The question was what landowners are in the mix for this project. I think it's a collaborative, so Baxter State Authority, definitely. Harpswell Heritage Land Trust owns a decent amount of marsh. Individual, do you think I can say his name online? Probably. Yeah, Steve Rowe, who owns down there. I don't know, felt intimate, but and honestly, that is a complicated part of these projects, because oftentimes the salt marsh portion of land is not really well described. It's not typically surveyed. You're not going to go out into the marsh and find a pin. And sometimes there's still legacy impacts of the Salt agricultural days where you have divided interest. So 10 people own the same 30 acres of marsh. And so that is a whole can of worms that's really, really complicated. And we're kind of digging into a little bit of that for this project, but I think we're on our way to a solution of some of the boundaries between Baxter State and another private landowner who we haven't gotten in contact with fully yet. Yeah.
Well, I would just add the Long Reach Association, the Road Association, the 7 of us, one being the Baxter State Park, would love to partner or be involved in some way. Have interest in getting across that causeway, but also we're all very fortunate to live in that area and see this stuff every day. And so I just wanted to a little plug in there for that. And also, in terms of research, there is a community school right there. And I'm sure there's many 3rd through 5th graders that would love to help monitor something or just learn some more about this marsh. I would just echo, this is a great presentation.
Thank you.
I think it really nicely summarizes what the issues are there. The question I have is it's not a culvert, but whatever it's called now, the DOT put in. Box culvert. Do you see any need to enlarge that or another land? Is that going to manage the flow of water during this process effectively? And of course, those of us who were there when that did, it looked like the St. Lawrence Seaway, quite honestly. And when it overtopped, is there possibly an opportunity to enhance that causeway on behalf of the vegetation and wildlife, as well as maintain that, that causeway as well? I have no idea, but it may be an opportunity. There's DEP, it's quite a process.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know if there are still folks on Zoom, but the kind of question was broadly some statements, and then about the road and its relationship with the project very broadly. But I would say that ideally with these projects, if the tidal transparency is going to widen, which I think the culvert now is basically fully transparent, is that correct? It's not restrictive anymore?
Probably not until the road overtops. Then it becomes very transparent.
Okay, I see. So there is some restriction there.
What do you mean by restriction?
So restriction is basically like unimpeded. The marsh or the water would come in and would come out in a specific way, and where you have these crossings that kind of act like a straw in a tunnel. Some crossings allow that flow to come in and out normally, and so we call that like fully transparent, fully tidally transparent, right? You're not feeling the effect of that road. A restriction is where that flow is impeded some way. Typically you're feeling it both on the incoming tide where the water is kind of building up behind it, and on the outgoing tide where it's not draining out through the road fast enough. So you get these kind of impacts on both sides. If you're doing road work and you're increasing the transparency of a crossing, you want to actually do this type of work, the hydrology work, ahead of time. So you're making the marsh prepped for more water so it could handle it and it could drain effectively. So I think order of operations, doing this type of work now makes sense, and then conversations about road crossings down the line, that Salt Marsh will be kind of prepped for any changes in water flow to the system.
And there is a restriction at every high tide now.
Yeah.
The striped bass love it. They just hang out in there and feed on everything that's coming out.
Little sushi belt.